Hello and welcome to this NBS webinar looking at the Building Safety Act. I'm Richard Waterhouse. I'm going to be chairing the session today, and I'm delighted to say that we've got a great panel who are going to take us through, after 8 months, where have we got to with the Building Safety Act, what's changed, what's working, where do we still need to make some changes, and also what happens next, where do we go in the future. I'm going to start by introducing the panel for you. So let's start with Neil. Do you want to just introduce yourself?
Thanks, Richard. I'm Neil Hope-Collins. I work for the Building Safety Regulator, and my role there was previously to help work with MHCLG to design and write the new regulations, the new regime, particularly for high-risk buildings. My role now is providing that first stop of support for the operational guys who are actually carrying out that building control function.
Fantastic. Thank you and welcome. Olga.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Olga Katsanova, and I work at Hilti, based here in the UK. I'm responsible for our technical marketing team that looks after also our digital design and engineering services, but also the product information. And I'm here to represent the voice of manufacturers and how we have changed the way we work since the introduction of the Building Safety Act.
Wonderful, and I'm looking forward to that because another key area for us, as is the contractor element. So, Alistair.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, I'm Alistair Mealy. I'm the technical leader for building safety at Laing O'Rourke, a large main contractor and engineering enterprise, and obviously we also have our own product set which we manufacture. And yeah, I generally look at implementing what I would call the building safety regime across all of our projects and supporting how we use it as a sort of enabler to just have more consistency across all what we do.
Wonderful, thank you. And yes, not just a contractor, of course, as we will hear. And Mike.
Hi, thank you. I'm Mike Riley. I'm an architect technical director from BDP, a large multidisciplinary practice of architects, engineers, and all sorts of design disciplines. I have recently taken over the sort of lead of what we call the building safety group. So we're responsible for really providing support and guidance on BSA and how to implement it, and really give the design teams within the UK a bit of support and guidance of how we deliver these large, complicated projects.
Wonderful, and we will delve into that. And last but not least, Stephen.
Yeah, hi there. I'm Stephen Hamill, Innovation Director at NBS, and we provide software tools and content to allow specifiers and manufacturers hopefully to work well within the new building safety regime.
Wonderful. And obviously it's an NBS webinar, so we will be looking in a little bit of detail about what the impact is with specifications, product information, how we actually manage that information. And also remember that on the NBS website, you've got access to lots of other documentation about the Building Safety Act. Also, go back and have another look at the webinar that was done earlier on this year prior to the final implementation. Lots of really useful information. But we're going to start with the Building Safety Act itself and the regulation. And Neil, could you just give us a little bit of background as to where we've got to so far? And also, I know there are some subtle differences with England and the devolved nations as well. Do you want to give us a little bit of background as to where we've got to?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Building Safety Act came in 18 months or so ago now, longer. The new regime for higher risk buildings and the changes to the Building Act and building regulations came in just over a year ago, October 2023. The nuances for the devolved nations are, and Scotland have their own completely independent regime. They have their own legal system, and in fact they were doing that, they were implementing the principles of this way before we were. When we were designing the new system, when we were looking at the new regime, we actually looked to Scotland and a lot of the guidance that they had produced and thought that's good stuff. We'd like to I came across a nice phrase, magpie some of that and bring it across. So those principles have been in place, and any of you who work across the border actually should be used to this. This should feel familiar, the new regime in England. In Wales, it's the same law, but it is enacted through the Secretary of State for Wales, and they will choose how they implement it. So the building safety regulator only works within England. Wales have their own way of implementing the legislation, though the law is the same across England and Wales. And across in Northern Ireland, I know they are looking at working at seeing how they can introduce the principles within their area. Just out of interest, the other element that had existed before in air in Southern Ireland, they had already brought in a very similar approach to product recording and evidence building through the construction phase. And again, when we were designing the system, we looked over to Southern Ireland, to Ireland itself, to say, how was that working, that particular aspect of the greater scrutiny through the construction phase, which is something we've brought in here. So that's kind of the history of where we've got to. The new regime, just to start, absolutely fundamentally in the building regs, the expectations of what a building needs to do to satisfy the functional requirements, those provisions A to now T, and regulation 7 and the regulations 20s, the thermal, the Part L regulations, those didn't change. If you built a building that was legal 3 years ago, it will be illegal now. Those things that make a building legal have not changed. The definition of building work has not changed. You'd be amazed the number of people who come to us asking whether a particular job is building work or not, and it's a job they've been doing for decades. They say, well, if it was building work 10 years ago, it's building work now. Those bits have not changed. What we brought in was some new duties across every bit of building work. There's now a new Part 2A, which brings in what we call the duty holder and competence requirements, which apply to all building work. And that's where you are now responsible for planning, managing and monitoring not only your own work, but the work of anybody who works for you. And that's about taking reasonable steps to be assured that if you're paying someone to do a job for you, they can do the job you're paying them to do, and that they can actually do that job. And then for the higher risk buildings, there's procedural regulations, and they're just that. They're procedures. They are a framework that tells you how you can comply with the Building Regs 2010, and particularly those Part 2A requirements. So it all hangs back to the Building Regs 2010. We just have new procedures for high risk buildings.
Fantastic. And we kind of brilliant. We kind of touched on their competencies as well. And I just get the feeling we've talked an awful lot about procedure over the last 8 months or so. And I do worry that competence has kind of dropped off the agenda. And I do want to come back to that in a few minutes' time. But let's just talk about these last 8 months. How is it going then in the regulator, in that function, and other things that you would like to see from the industry that you're not getting at the moment?
So it was a slow start. Everybody was very polite and saying, no, after you can be the first one to put in an application, please. It's amazing how polite the construction industry can be when it wants to be. We have now started to ramp up. We are getting applications in. The majority of the applications are for work in existing HRBs. Vast majority, only 8% of the applications we've had so far are for new build. And of the applications for work in existing buildings, it's around a 50-50 split between the regulation set out category B, which is the lower risk work, which doesn't really have an impact. The principle is this is the work that shouldn't have an impact on the wider building fire strategy or structurally. And then the category A work, which is everything else. We're in an existing building, about a 50-50 split.
Wonderful. And
we've been learning.
Sorry, keep going. Yeah.
We have been learning, and I'm sure everybody is aware of the challenges we had, and there's statements have been made about the backlog by people more senior than me, and it is, I see the figures every day. It is coming down hugely drastically. The guys are really pulling all the stops out and working to move that through without building up another one. So they're running parallel. Of the applications come in,
I was going to say we don't need to get into those numbers. I am really quite interested in the and how the actual process is going. So I think quite a number have been rejected, and I'm interested in understand a little bit more about what makes a good application, what makes a poorer application.
What's really interesting is that there's before BSR makes a determination, the application has to be valid. But in order to be valid, all people have to do is go down the checklist, which is either Regulation 12 or Regulation 4 of the HRB procedures regs, because it's a checklist. It says include this, and it's a nice long list. If you've included everything on that list, it will be valid. Currently, how many? I had the 53% of applications are not valid. That means people just haven't given us what the law asks them to give us. Interestingly enough, once with those applications that are valid, the figures that I've seen in a moment, around 60% of those applications are being approved. So of the valid applications, the majority are being approved. Those that are not being approved, it's because they haven't given us enough detail. They haven't told us exactly what it is they're going to be building. They haven't told us enough detail how they're going to be assured that they will build it. And we'll come back to the competency and the planning, managing and monitoring, I'm sure, in the rest of the discussion. But it's those elements where they're not giving us enough detail. There are still a lot that are in train. We are assessing them. And our approach in assessing the starting point was to do a lot of back and forth, a lot of give us more information. Can we have some more here? Honestly, we were doing that to learn, and we were probably doing that a little bit too much rather than doing the cruel to be kind. And look, there is so much that you need here. You just need to go away and give us a bit more and do a bit more work and bring it back. We were putting in the time to try and explain. That is one of the reasons it's been taking so long to get applications to a point where there's a decision, because there was so much back and forth. A year in now, we are now starting to move that down and reaching decisions much quicker. That does mean that we reach a no much quicker where we haven't had sufficient information to be able to make the decision.
Yeah. And where would people go to find those checklists?
So those two checklists, I said, the regulations themselves. The buildings brackets, higher risk buildings procedures, close brackets, regulations 2023. Regulation 4 is the regulation that says your application for a new build must include these things. Regulation 12 is the one that says if you're doing building work in an existing building, your application must include this list. What I would say to people, if people take one thing away, please don't be scared of reading these regulations. We wrote them in plain English. We wrote them so that they're easy to understand. I have a number of times when people have asked for greater guidance, read out some words, said, is that what you mean? They say, yes, that's exactly what I mean. And I said, I've just read the regulations.
Neil, I'm just going to jump in if that's all right. We hear a lot about the Gateway 2 process, but for those approved post Gateway 2, are you seeing lots come through the change management process, or are people just making no changes now? Once you've had approval, they're building what's been designed.
So we don't remember what I said about only 8% of new build.
Yeah.
The vast majority are building work in existing buildings, and that means that the jobs have been a lot smaller. They've been largely domestic clients. So where I'm getting to is we haven't had enough projects that have needed or been of the sort where you would expect change control to be coming in later in the project to actually build up a picture yet. We're still in very early days about the next stage, next step. And if I may, one of my current soapbox, everybody is focused on the Gateway 2 application. It is the springboard and the start of the process. The important thing is to remember is you've then got to build this thing, and then you've got to get a completion certificate. If you focus on the completion certificate application, let's focus on the bricks and mortar. Focus on what you will need to give us to demonstrate that your actual building satisfies the functional requirements, and work back from that. Because your Gateway 2 application is just the desktop exercise that says, this is what we will be giving you for your completion certificate. And if people start to think about the Gateway 2 application as this is what we anticipate we will give you as our completion certificate application, easy for me to say, I think they will do a lot better with that Gateway 2 application. It's not a thing in it, it's not a standalone. It sets up the starter, it sets up everything that comes after, the construction and the final building. Thank you for indulging me with that last soapbox.
That kind of leads us to the last of these questions, which is that we've seen some applications have been approved with conditions. So what does that mean, and how does that fit with the process?
So the new vocabulary is not conditions, it's requirements.
Right.
And it's kind of conditions in old money, but I've used the phrase it's conditions on steroids. So I'm sure that none of you have ever seen a conditional approval under the old regime that said condition 1, comply with part A, condition 2, comply with part B. I'm sure none of you ever saw any of those sort of things going out in the past. I certainly didn't. So the conditions historically have been, shall we say, broad. In the new regime, because what we're aiming for is an anticipation of that completion certificate, so telling us what it is, what evidence you will bring at that last stage for the completion certificate application, we do want more assurance right at the start that whatever you do through the construction phase, the building, the bricks and mortar, will satisfy the functional requirements. So we do need far more information up front than we used to. There are legitimately areas, particularly on new build, where work made with specialist contractors, and I'm thinking maybe particularly M&E packages, where the work it's not, you haven't got the contractor in yet, and it's years before you will do. So it is possible, and we will push back, it is possible to come to us and say, this particular element here, and we've used sprinklers throughout as the example, we don't have the final pipe runs. We don't have the exact make of the nozzle head. We don't have the final specification, the final detailed design. But what we do have, we know the principle we're going. We know it's going to be mist or drench. We know where the water's coming from. And if it is a header tank at the top of the building, we know that part A structure will hold that thing up off the ground and without the building coming down. We know where the emergency power is coming from. We know that everything that surrounds that contract that we're going to be putting out. So we can be assured that whatever the specialist contractor comes back with, the building will still satisfy the functional requirements. That element that would be specified for the specialist contractor, it is possible to make that a requirement. And in effect, that pushes the Gateway 2 years down the line. It's an offence to start work on that part of the job until you have brought the design detail and we have assessed it, but it doesn't stop you starting the substantive work elsewhere. When we work through this with a set of Class 3 RBIs working out how our policy might work on this, they told us what we know already. We have to be very careful with this because it does have the scope to completely undermine the principles of the new regime. So if people come to us wanting to talk about an approval with requirements, expect a lot of pushback. Why can't you get this detail now? And no, you're leaving it far too broad. We want this to be better specified right at the start and really nail it down to, it's just this little bit of information that we're requiring, and we're going to start on the rest of it with that. So really come with your arguments. It's not for us as the regulator to tell you where the requirements are. It would be for you as the applicant to say, these are the elements where we really don't feel we've got the information. Will you let us push that down the road? And for us to push back and go, well, our starting point is no. Now persuade me otherwise, and persuade me how the building is going to be legal, even with this little gap. What have you surrounded it enough? Have you specified enough around it? So similar sound to conditions, but their requirements, and we will be very much more on them, and a lot more rigorous and strict around them.
And that you mentioned the word specification and specify there. So having a very, very strong performance specification that details what this system will achieve is going some way towards demonstrating that the designers know where they're going with these systems. But then does it, because these are fire systems in effect, and they'll be going through compartment walls, etc., does this require a major change application then further down the line?
And this is where the specification needs to be right in the first place, because you may not know exactly where the final pipe runs are going, but you will. We would expect you to know exactly how the compartmentation is going to be maintained wherever they go. We'd expect you to know generally where they need to be. Because you should have set out. If you haven't set out where the common parts are, where the residential elements are, then it's going to be a no straight away. So you should already have enough information to be able to fill those gaps, and it's just the fine detail. And actually, that's a really nice. I think that's really helpful, Richard, to be able to sort of say, if you're getting into trying to argue the requirement about some of the stuff that would be substantive and have a wider impact, then you haven't specified it enough.
That's a great segue. Neil, thank you for all of that. That's a wonderful, wonderful start. So let's move into design. Let's come over to Mike and say, Mike, how's it been for you over the last 8 months, and what learnings have you made during that process?
Well, I think the important thing that Neil was saying earlier, that actually there's been a substantial move towards sort of better documenting our designs for quite a long period of time. So the actual the requirements to say how the buildings are actually performing, etc., and are they meeting the regulations, hasn't fundamentally changed. So we've been, sorry, my cat is making a. So as one of the sort of general trends that we've been seeing is that we have been putting a lot more focus into sort of the design teams being really responsible for what they're doing, making sure that they have a really clear understanding of how the building should comply, and then making that strong case to the regulator or the registered approver, rather than us sort of sending things over the fence and saying, oh, well, can the regulator tell us whether it complies or not? So there's a lot more sort of being a critical friend in the room, rather than actually sort of relying on regulators to actually tell us where we're doing well. I think the things that have changed for us really, now that the BSA has come out sort of more fully, we've developed quite a strong management system for BDP, which is actually trying to get consistency across all of the UK. So I know there are subtleties in how the regulations are applied depending on the different legal regions, but fundamentally, if you come to BDP, you should have the same spirit, the same culture of how we design our buildings safely. And the documents that we produce and the actual regulations we're complying with might change, subtly from region to region, but fundamentally you should get that same sort of idea that we're taking ownership of something and actually driving that compliance forwards. But obviously to sort of help all of our designers, we do find that there is some people who feel quite daunted by the change. They sort of they are worried by it. So what we tend to find is that we've put into place a support structure across all the various offices, where we're actually putting a lot of investment into upskilling a core group of people so they can disseminate information across all of our design teams more effectively. So we've called that the building safety group, and that's what I'm leading in the practice. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to actually sort of break down the sort of complexities of the structure that we put in place, and actually make sure that there is a culture of almost curiosity about the regulations. I think as part of that sort of curiosity piece, there are obviously a lot of opinions about what the regulations say and what the guidance is, and there's a lot of people writing articles on the internet, etc. And I think one of the critical things that I think Neil said was, saving the sort of link on your web browser to the regulations and reading the regulations is actually really helpful. You can go through them, and I agree that there's small snippets of information. You can break it down into section by section. It's actually quite an easy to understand sort of series of websites that you can go to actually give yourself core information. And I think the sort of final part of that then is actually what we're sort of seeing is that because of all of the sort of noise and the guidance and people's interpretation of what has actually been written, you do get a lot of strange opinions coming from various people. I mean, particularly, things like, you're going to be the principal designer, are you going to validate our designs? Things like that. You have to sort of like go, well, no, not at all. That's not what we're doing. So, we're almost finding that there's a culture of education, empowering people, sharing best practice, and we as a company are being quite open with that, because I think sharing not just internally but externally is really valuable, because actually it will generally make the industry better and safer, and I think that's what everybody genuinely wants to achieve.
And within BDP, are you applying these new processes to all projects, or do you work on HRBs a different way?
The process is broadly similar, because we're actually fundamentally trying to make sure all our buildings are safe. But what I'd say is that the response is proportional to the size and complexity of the project. So we have buildings which are not HRBs that we are saying, hold on a minute, this is super complicated. It's a massive sci-tech development, whatever. It's of a significant size that you can invest the time, effort, and it's required in a sense to actually sort of make sure we understand how that building operates, how it sort of works. Have we documented it correctly? Can we actually pass that information on to the next suite of designers or the client so that they understand how their building works? So our process, is very, very, very rigorous, but you apply different parts of the process to different levels of complexity of building. So if we were doing a sort of, a very small building for us, the sort of, for a couple of £1 million sort of office building or something like that, very, very small, very simple, we wouldn't necessarily do every document, but we would actually take the same approach. And I think that's the important thing, that the approach is very similar.
Yeah. If I can just jump in there, that is music to my ears. And what I've been saying, like, the important changes are the changes in the building regs. I think particularly the Part 2A requirements, those duties to plan, to manage, and to monitor, and to think about what each of those three words mean at the different stages. And being aware that the planning, managing, and monitoring is for people that you are paying to do the job, as well as the people you directly employ. So it goes down the contractor chain, both for designers and for contractors. All the HRB procedures regs do is give one way of complying with those bits of the regulations. We've actually made it easier in some ways for the HRBs, because we've said, you've got these new duties over here. Here is a model for how you comply with those. We've given it to you. We have given you that template of what procedures you have to go through to comply with these aspirational duties. For everything else, they're the same duties. So if the model works over here for HRBs and you get used to a management system for your company and the way you work, then why not use the same management system, whatever the building? And that is really one of the things. The other word that I'm really glad you used was curiosity. There was a colleague right at the start of this, we're working in the HRB unit in BSR, who said right at the start, people need to be curious about their buildings. And those were her very words. Everybody needs to be curious about your building. And so I love the fact that you've used that word there. Sorry, Richard, for jumping in with that.
No, that's wonderful. It actually, I've got to say, one of the values of MBS is be curious. So it fits perfectly for MBS as well. So, Mike, within BDP, you've been a long time user of MBS. You're really great at managing all of the information, the specifications, etc. We know that. But one of the requirements is to know that you are capable of doing the job. Let's get into a little bit about competencies. How does BDP approach the area of competencies as part of this process, particularly around principal designer?
Yeah, well, particularly around principal designer. Well, I think there's many parts of the sort of competencies. I think that because the sort of Building Safety Act regulations have come in, doesn't necessarily mean that all of our designers suddenly become incompetent overnight. So that's a really important thing to recognise. These are people who have spent years and years and years in the industry, designing buildings competently, safely, delivering projects well for the whole industry. So what have we done that's different is when we're actually looking at how our project teams are actually sort of organised, we're actually starting to encourage our staff to do almost self-competency checks. So actually, rather than us telling people, oh, we've worked in this sector before, we're actually asking them to think about, well, what sort of competence do you think we have? And we're breaking it down to, you know, have you managed a project in this sector? Because BDP is a sort of big organisation. We split the architecture profession down into the various sectors, and that allows us to share best practice and get sort of little pockets of sort of real in-depth knowledge in what we're doing. So what we tend to do is we sort of say sector by sector, have you got experience in the sector? Yes, that's good. Have you managed a project in that sector? That's the next level up. And we're using that sort of self-competency check to almost validate the selection of a design team as we're going forwards into the project. Now, I think the sort of concerns that people have with that approach is that, well, I've never worked in that sector. Does that mean I can never work in that sector? And we're saying, well, no, that's not our approach at all. What we're saying is we're identifying the fact that you do have experience in designing a building. We need you to work on this building type, so we're going to put support in place to actually help you actually have access to the people who have done that work before, and actually recognize that we need to do a little bit more management, a little bit more support around what you're doing to actually make sure that we don't miss anything. Basically, you know, we need to make sure that fundamentally things are actually working well. So on top of that, I mean, if you were relating it back to sort of known sort of terminology, I mean, fundamentally what I'm sort of talking about is making sure that everybody's got the right skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours to work on a project. You know, that is how they define it, isn't it, as part of the regime. So we're making sure that people are starting to talk in those languages. We're making sure that our CVs have all been updated so that the people we're asking as principal designers are starting to put those behavioural statements on their CVs. They're starting to actually acknowledge that they need to, declare any sanctions and enforcements against them and all of the things like that. And we're actually collating all this information a little bit more rigorously than we would have done 10 years ago. So, because what we tend to find is that a lot of clients are saying, it's great that you are offering us this service. Now, what are you doing to actually make sure that you are competent? And they're proactively asking us questions. They're sending us pro formas to fill in, some of which are better than others. I think it might be said. Some are asking some very strange questions, but when you boil it down and you do a bit of an education piece with them, they understand why you're actually making certain comments. But I think fundamentally, as part of that, I think it's really positive that the RIBA and other organisations are actually trying to put in place assessment tools and registers, etc., to actually enable the client to have a third-party sort of accreditation almost and sort of view on people who are putting themselves forward as PDs. And I think that's actually a very valuable thing to actually take a positive, proactive step to sort of put that in place.
I'm going to come across to Olga in just a second, just to talk about competencies, but just one last one with you. Are you asking clients as to whether they're competent, and how are you checking that clients are competent? I know we're going to talk contractors in a minute as well, and we'll see a little bit about relationships there, but you've got a duty as well, haven't you, with the client? So how are they taking that?
I think the thing about general competencies of others is quite a thorny subject, and some people react better than others to it. So the designers are generally quite happy to sort of talk about their own competencies, etc. It does depend sector by sector. And for example, I work quite heavily in the higher education sector. And all of our projects are run by experienced estates teams who have delivered a huge amount of projects throughout their their lifetime. So they've got a sort of proven track record, and you can sort of tell by the processes that organisation put in place that they actually know what they're talking about and they understand the context of what they're doing. Most NHS trusts also fall into that category. You know, they are used to actually working with a sort of rigorous process, and they understand how the process works. We haven't come across a position where we've said a client is incompetent yet, though I'll keep an eye out for that one and see whether actually that ever does crop up. I think if we were to get to that sort of situation, in all honesty, I think, you know, we've got to embrace this sort of culture of knowledge sharing and actually upskilling. You know, if they need a bit of help, that's why they employ professional teams to do that, don't they? They employ an architect because they need somebody who understands design and building. They employ a competent contractor because, you know, they employ Langer Rock because they know that they're good at what they do. You know, that is what they do, isn't it? And we should help them get to that point.
And Olga, while we're talking competency, this is a big area for manufacturers as well, isn't it? Particularly with installers and that process.
Yes, I think when it comes to competence and manufacturers, there's different angles. On one hand, we need to make sure we are competent, and obviously quite often we are experts of the products that we sell. So there's certain processes that we've had to put in place to really make sure that the people that specify and sell our product, that they are competent. But then there is, you know, back to the point that Mike said about knowledge sharing. A lot of the products that we sell, or for example, the portfolio of Firestop products that are in the compartments, the decisions that used to be made very late in the process, the topic of competency, we used to deal with it with the topic of installer training and are they competent. Now this has shifted, actually. These products are now designed and thought of up front, which we welcome, but then the competence requirement is no longer necessarily the installer or only the installer. Actually, a lot of the competence requests that we get is much earlier in the design process. How should I specify with the products? Where is the data? Are there any design tools available? Could you run a CPD or a training seminar with the design team? And sometimes even hands-on experience with the design teams is very useful, so they know how the product is actually placed, you know, into the compartments. So for me, this has been the shift for us, and that's where we also had to establish, you know, making sure that if an architect company comes to us with a request for the training, you know, we might not be able to reach everybody face to face, but is there solid webinars in place? Is there an offering there as well? So I would say manufacturers also had to step up and be prepared to support the industry much earlier in the design process, which I think is a very good thing.
And this must mean that you encourage the designers and contractors to engage with you to find out more about how this should be done and how it should be done properly.
Yes, I mean, we've done this for many, many years, but right now it's becoming much more standard to make sure that, you know, that architects would be curious about the applications and the design that they do.
Mike, we're going to be using that word curious right the way through this webinar. So let's move on then. So we're understanding about clients and design. Ultimately, we've got to get to the construction phase as well. And with Langer Rourke, we've got a contractor that has so many facets to this. So how's it been for you, Alistair, and in terms of the different elements of the work that you do?
Oh, big question. I think the first thing I should say, we've been quite lucky in the fact that our higher risk buildings are healthcare. So actually we've had some time. So we haven't had a load of residential projects we've had to quickly think about implementing them. So we've had the fortune of having some time to be considered about implementing these processes and the ways to respond to the new legislation. Just picking up on a couple of points which Neil and Mike have made. I think the biggest, I don't want to call it a positive and negative, but so it's the what I'll call them is a challenge and opportunity. The challenge has definitely been around the understanding of what building regulations are. That's been a huge, as Neil alluded to, they haven't changed, but actually people's understanding of how they are used and what they actually mean has been huge. So that the education piece around that has been a big part of what myself and others within the business have been doing for the past year and a bit. But the opportunity has actually been how much talking, and this is part of that has happened between the industry where it didn't happen previously. That collaboration piece has ramped up significantly, and there's just a much more open sharing of knowledge, how people have been getting on, what's happened here, the sort of the intel, and that discussion has been really welcome, actually, and the openness around it has been a huge positive. And we've tried to facilitate as many discussions as we can with design partners, and ultimately, a lot of their messaging from the BSR has been that, you know, we're looking for the industry to respond and help us help you get applications through. So I think that's a key point here, is that we have to keep working together and work together more and not be siloed. We need to share what is good, and we need to share what is bad as well, to help us all to collectively make the process as smooth as possible and ultimately make more consistent, safer buildings. That's the general message here. In terms of actual,
that's really interesting for me, actually, because if we look at other industries like oil and gas and aviation, there is an open culture of failure, of sharing what went wrong to ensure that it can't happen again. And actually doing more of that sounds like a no-brainer.
Absolutely. We have, as I said, we've kind of immersed ourselves in the world of all of this, and we've had some workshops which, you know, the dialogue in them, I haven't seen in all the years before I was in the industry, and just in terms of the openness and actually everyone trying to help each other, you know, because this is not, you know, it is different. The procedure part is different, and as anything is, and it's new, you know, and it takes some time to get used to and embed, and I'm sure it will tweak and change and evolve over the coming years some more. A phrase I've coined, which I've used a few times, is we're kind of at the we're in the middle of the beginning rather than the beginning of the middle of all of this, and there's plenty more to go. And I think also it's important that we don't think of it as the Building Safety Act was the point where this all started. This all started actually, quite thankfully, very soon after Grenfell with Regulation 7 and other things. So this is a part of a journey, not sort of a point where things started. And there'll be other points on that road as we get into generally building safer buildings, you know. In terms of overall processes, we have tried to align what we do on what I'll call non-HRB projects with what we do on HRBs. Obviously, it's not exactly the same, but there's certain aspects, especially the accompanying documents. You think to yourself, why didn't every project always have a building regulations compliance statement? You know, it's just as they didn't, but when you think about it, well, every single job should have had. And going forward, how we implement things, they just will, because tracking that way is simpler and actually signposting to information better. And one thing around all of this documentation, which trying to distill it to people in saying, well, what has changed? I think a big part of this is obviously the evidencing. So it's the why rather than the what, which is a huge part of this. And actually, it's interesting when you look at earlier stages of design and construction. So when you're at stage 2 and 3 and planning, a lot of those reports and those design information has a bit of a story in it. It's like why we did this and why we didn't select that option and all of that piece. And when you get to stage 4, it's like, and this is what we're doing. And that why you've done it gets forgotten sometimes. And then ultimately, as Neil said, looking right to the end, because ultimately having the gateway 2 information, which then becomes gateway 3, and actually that's basically your basis of your golden thread, is that piece, is at the end, what you want is proportional information where someone maintaining a building can say, well, we need to repair that, we need to change that, or we need to alter that. But why did they make this decision of using this product and this set and this set of materials in the first place? And that stops them, and being very simple here, drilling a hole in something and thinking that's okay, we fix it, but then they don't understand what else they've, you know, disrupted in doing so. So that's the, in my belief, the story of all of this and where we need to be getting to. So that why rather than the what is the big thing here. And then in terms of actually how we've done some of this, so we are interestingly enough, I think we've spent more time around duty holders in general, in the fact of, like, a vast majority of our projects aren't high-risk buildings. And there was definitely, and we discussed the earlier version of this 8 months ago, that actually sort of it caught people by surprise that the duty holders apply to all buildings where, you know, there's building work and then building regulations apply. So as a main contractor with contractual design responsibility at that point, we have been asked to be principal designer as well as principal contractor on many opportunities. And the way we've handled that is actually we said, well, we can do that, but we've bolstered it by employing advisors and using actually the design team themselves to, you know, input into that process, because there's, you know, it's a collective effort, and to make sure that on the competency point, you know, that competency is bolstered by you know, people who have more specialities. That's the key thing. And what's interesting now is where our specialist businesses are being asked to look at projects and how they fit in as effectively subcontractors or contractors earlier in the process. And then, you know, that you've got points of principal contractor being handed to someone else on really large schemes. Similarly, principal designers being handed across. And again, it's all about making sure it's not just recording, you know, the physical, what you're designing, but also recording that process and that carrying over as well. So yeah, there's lots to go at.
So lots of change, but by the sounds of it, all good. It's actually improving the way that you're working.
Ultimately, absolutely. Consistency has been used in all this, and that consistency just simply has to be created. And also, it will move things to the left of the program. It has to. We have to have more in place before we start work. It's as simple as that. And it's you know, and you know, we work on highly complex bespoke buildings, so some things you're going to really have to dial into that detail, because it isn't as simple as, you know, even with an amazing performance specification, sometimes you just might need to get something tested to know it works before you can get going. You might need to, you know, and the thing is, there isn't a one size fits all, and certainly, again, proportional has been used, but it's true, you have to be proportional to what ultimately you're building and the timescale for it. But yeah, we're trying to make it as consistent as possible across all of everything we do. The fact that we actually effectively see that building safety being a function within larger businesses like ourselves. So where you have a health and safety team, and that's a standard thing, building safety being a function in itself is something which we see coming, you know. And at the moment, I'm building a team of people to help with this. And obviously, BDP have discussed this. They have a building safety group which is effectively doing that within their organisation already. One of actually an interesting part has been where how the principal duty holders turn up and what their scope is on projects which aren't high risk buildings. So the high risk building, actually, with the definitive accompanying documents and everything, makes it really easy to set out and give themselves a scope of what they're doing. On non-high risk buildings, actually, yes, there's the duties which are really clear within the regulations, or in the building regs. But actually, what does that turn up to in deliverables terms? And that's actually something which is still being formulated, and definitely isn't a one size fits all or a standard list yet. But that's coming, and I think that's evolving, and that's a big bit of work around that has been going on as well.
So we're seeing a focus on building safety in the design side and creating teams to facilitate that, seeing change in construction, so all of that. Manufacturers, Olga, you've already said when we were talking competencies that you've been brought in earlier in that, so we're seeing things moving to the left. How else is it affecting your community?
I mean, the one big topic is obviously around product information and making sure that it's clear, accessible, and for sure there has been more demand for more information or different formats, more details. It was, I think Alistair just mentioned, you know, sometimes requests for additional testing. So all of this is coming through. So I would say products and the data, and where do we place it, right, to make sure that specifiers can access this. There's been a pull for design tools as well. So again, for the specifiers, contractors to be able to place our products into their application. So be it through selectors or, you know, similar, or actually having access to a Hilti expert to guide them through the specification process. So I would say this whole element around product data, that has been big for us. But the other angle that I want to also share, because the decisions are made quite early in the process now, this actually unlocks a huge opportunity to optimize the designs, because again, if our product is selected very late in the process, you can't change, you can't optimize, you can't, you can't move the pipes around anymore. So sometimes you end up with a very expensive, very, not optimized opportunity. So being involved much earlier in design process also allows us as manufacturers to explain, why one solution might be better than the other, or how we could optimize things. And then there's new topics coming in like sustainability. We can start discussing that quite early in this, so we end up with safer, more sustainable, more productive designs that can be installed in a more optimized way. So for me, that's a huge, that's a different game that we now play, because we engage earlier, and I think there are benefits for all involved, for the specifier who specifies, that understands what their decisions mean, for the contractors to actually understand, oh yes, if we did it this way, it'll be much faster, more productive on site. So the discussions are not about what's how much this or that product costs very late in the stage. It's actually what is the right solution for the scenario at hand, what's the most optimal solution throughout. So for me, that has been a really welcome change, because again, in the design stage, you can still change things. Once things are already, on site, sometimes we end up maybe the products that are selected are not the most optimal ones.
I'd second that as well. I mean, we've worked quite closely with Hilti through another one of the BDP initiatives, which is about actually, we have a sort of technical group, and very early in design stages now, we've worked with Hilti to come up with a series of principles for our pacifier protection, for example, and we use that really early doors to actually brief the MEP engineers about how far apart all of their services need to be. So actually, rather than cramming everything into corridors as we might have done 10, 15 years ago, now things are spreading out, they're being a lot more accessible. It's a considered concept really early doors. So and those are a set of details that we fundamentally worked with them to say, with Hilti, to say, this works, it's this product, it's this certification, we've got records of it, we review it relatively regularly, and then we can actually test it on specific projects as we need to. But we know when we go into a design that there is at least a solution that works before we get too far down the line.
That's
yes,
music to Olga's ears, I think.
Yes, and it still happens now as well that, somebody would say, this is what we've built, do you have testing for it? And for me, I've always said, why do, now I need to go out and test something because you've not built it in the right way in the first. So that was very, very common, or completely incorrect products. But for me, now that we bring these discussions earlier into the design stage, it just eliminates all of that discussion late in the process that delays the project. And I mean, there's many implications of that. So for me, that's been a very welcome change, but it has meant that we need to organize ourselves differently. So we employ many more engineers now into our organization. We also now make sure that the architects have access to our experts. That was not the case before. Our focus was further down the chain, because that's when the product was ultimately selected. But now this happens much earlier in the process. So we had to adapt the way we are organized as well.
And on the golden thread, there's requirements for information keeping, some of which is around product information, testing, certification. CCPI, where's CCPI in all of this?
So I would say CCPI sets out very good principles. And for me, CCPI, Code of Practice, or the golden rules of that being put forward quite some years back. So we've always, as soon as it came out, we've calibrated the principles. I would say as Hilti, we always said, well, these principles do apply to us. But now, increasingly, more and more manufacturers adopt the Code of Practice, where actually they go through the process, the assessment process, and then assessing the product sets against it. So as a company, we've also been on the journey. On one hand, applying the principles, and that's we've done that before, but now we are also taking the next steps. So yes, CCPI is another good examples where manufacturers can then reflect, do the principles of the code, is that in place? So I think it's a really good reflection that all manufacturers should do, and then actually going through the certification process. Again, I think it's a welcome change. It really gets you to think through, do we have good processes in place?
Yeah, Richard, if I maybe come in a little bit there, at MBS, we've just signed a partnership with CPI Limited that looks after the code. And I think it's all about just manufacturers providing clear, current and correct information. We try and do that with our MBS source platform. I think it's worth also looking upstream and downstream of that. So if a product is specified, have you told that story of the product specified because it needs to meet the performance of that system? And the new content we've done at MBS at the elemental level, actually tracing that system back to what the element performance was, whether that's the roof or the wall or the floor. So capturing that sort of whole narrative all the way upstream, and then downstream changes will happen. So we've done a lot of work, again, in our specification system on tightening up the change management, tracking the publication history, and really clearly showing what the revisions are when revisions need to be made. And hopefully that's the sort of tools that people need to demonstrate to regulators or the sort of local authority building control. This is what we built.
It gives you that audit trail, and you can see how those changes have taken place, when they took place, even down to who made those changes as well. So that, I think that fits perfectly. And I think in many ways, MBS is pretty central to a lot of things we've talked about today. You know, making sure you get things right early on, integrating product information with your performance specification, making sure you bring some of those decisions to the left, as we've talked about. I think it's been a fantastic runaround. I'd just like some final comments from all of you on the panel. So Neil, I'm going to start with you. From what you've heard, I saw you smiling a little bit earlier when Alistair was talking. Are you happy what you've heard?
Absolutely. It's the fundamentals are the 2010 building regs are the law. That's what they apply to all buildings. Procedures for HRBs just give one way of achieving those, complying with those regulations, but take it as a whole, and it has to be a proportionate approach. I think my one comment on the competency is beware of confidence rather than competence. The law requires competence, not just confidence. Confidence, people will declare. Competence, they can demonstrate. And it's competence for what? It's not an absolute. It's for the job in question. So I think those would be my comments. Think about the bricks and mortar. What's your end result? Where are you wanting to get to? And then work back from that. And the process should or then all fall in place. If you keep in mind, we need to be able to tell the story of this building.
Yeah, wonderful, Mike.
I think that thing about telling the story of the building is actually quite powerful, and I think this is where MBS has supported us quite a lot in the past, because actually we do a lot about sort of our one source of the truth, and we've been talking about this for like 15 years as we've been developing our BIM processes and linking things through to specifications. I think now the challenge is to not just link it to the spec, but actually then have the database behind it, which demonstrates that you've also got the certification. So there's a sort of beautiful chain of information management here that you can actually you can create this thing which is inherently really structured, really rigorous. And I think one of the critical things from our point of view is actually we've talked for the last decade or so about making our designers more part of the specification process. I think that is an absolutely critical part of it. They will be making choices day in, day out, and over the last decade, we've been pushing to make sure that the spec writer isn't sat in the corner of the office churning things out. They're actually part of the team, and it's a two-way flow of information from the written, the graphical, and the certification information. So actually, that recording and digital management system is really important. I think the opportunity for the industry to do something better is probably actually then passing that design information over into actually proprietary facilities management systems, and that process does actually require a lot of work at the moment to get it right, and actually I think there's an opportunity for us to smooth that by actually trying to find some really good tools that are actually allowing the information to be exported and imported much more smoothly, because it is a bit of a challenge for the industry at the moment, I would say, with that one.
There's some thoughts for MBS. Alistair.
Some great points already. I think just keep talking. I think keep this open and honest dialogue up. You know, there's going behind the curtain on this. We have a whole host of topics we didn't even get a chance to even mention because of just how much you can, you know, the in-depth you need to be on these things. You know, they're not easy subjects, and they need that open and honest dialogue, and everyone, the industry, helping each other. That's the only way what ultimately will get the culture change that is needed and continue on that journey. So yeah, keep talking.
Fabulous. Olga.
I think from my side, you know, message to the designers, but also to contractors out there, you can demand more and more clear information from manufacturers. So please continue to do this, but also don't hesitate to engage us earlier in the stages, because I think sometimes there is this barrier. Well, I don't want to tie myself to one or the other manufacturer quite early on, but I think, you know, we welcome this, because then we can really discuss what are the applications, what are the scenarios you're facing, and what's the right solution. So for me, you know, welcome, and use the different design tools. Many manufacturers are now producing, you know, the selectors, the design tools, you know, better information, better access, and even software solution for documenting the golden thread. So again, you know, use the tools that are out there. There are many, and, you know, be curious, grow your competence, and again, manufacturers can support on that journey as well, because we know our products very well. So again, just don't hesitate to engage earlier.
Wonderful. Stephen. On mute, Stephen.
Yeah, finish backing up some of the comments on knowledge sharing. And like we've tried at MBS over the last 12 months or so, like at the high level, you can Google the names. We've got keynotes from Paul Morell and Dame Judith Hackett, which you can find on our website. Then going down to the details, we got the articles that we got for yourself, Richard, from our technical team, from myself on the software. Looking outside of what we've got on the MBS website, the HSC YouTube channel that I've watched a few presentations from Neil, people from the OPSS, some really good stuff there. And I think the RIBA has done some really good stuff as well, and their principal designer guide and the building regs checker they've done. So some great stuff. If you Google it afterwards, I will send the links round. It's just about the knowledge share. Fabulous.
So we've heard that things are moving to the left here, not politically, but in terms of the process. But it's making things better. It actually helps all of our projects. And I think that's something that HSE were really pleased to see, that it's going to improve general safety and improvements in design and delivery, not just for HRBs. I think that's great. We think Gateway 3, not Gateway 2, when we're thinking about our process, that actually the specification is vital. I'm sure MBS will love that. Plan, manage, monitor is the overall thinking of that approach. And of course, from Mike, we heard that culture of curiosity. Let's make sure we ask the questions and make sure we get it right. Please do come back to the MBS website, come and find out all these sources of information. There will be follow-ups to this. There's so much to see on the MBS website. But on your behalf, I'd like to say thank you to the panel. I've really enjoyed it. It's been hugely informative once again. And I look forward to see you all again and seeing more about how we can make the industry better. Thank you very much.